Hello. Today I will be speaking about migration and migration not in terms as such of migration studies, not in that way, but I'll be speaking about migration from a literary point of view. This would be more like a survey of literature than a theoretical interrogation of sorts. So that is what I plan to do, look at migration. Now, before getting into the discussion as such, you might think that migration is something that is a part of almost all kinds of discourse that you can think of. Because some kind of migration, some kind of movement is always there. And these movements, they have ruled the human experience over the years. They have dominated human interactions. They have shaped human history. So migration remains, it always was, and it remains one of the major moving factors of historical narratives, of the idea of civilization, and of what we know as international relations. So migration is vital. I mean, if you think about it, Iliad, if you think about Indian epics, Ramayana, you will see there are ideas of migration involved. There are ideas of journeys involved. Finding new locations, settling in new locations, creating new identities in new locations in one way or the other, establishing one identity replacing another one, creating one kind of cultural hegemony over another one. And of course, there is this idea of economics and commerce that is very much a part of this kind of discourse. So Iliad, Odyssey, Ramayana, Mahabharata, El Cid, and you can exhaust the list and you will see all these epics have these journeys which create new identity matrices. So they become a kind of representative of human movements in history, as I have already said. So these patterns, the politics of these movements, they have been glorified, they have been always politicized, they have been mourned, they have spoken of hope, and what they have always done is that they have always remained a witness to one kind of displacement or another. So these have always been one of the most recognizable patterns that you can think of. And even if you think about the Old Testament, even if you think about the slaves escaping Egypt and going to the promised land, and what about the people who were already there on the promised land, if there were any people at all there? Anyway, so this kind of, there is one displacement which results in another displacement, which makes home, which becomes a promised home for one set of people, perhaps taking away the home of another set of people. And this is a politics that is still ruling the planet. That is a politics that is in discussion, that is a reality, that is creating new hegemonies even now in the 21st century. So such migrations and such displacements are always there. And in fact, if you think about history is mostly history of conquests. That's what we have always learned, that history is one of conquests. And this kind of conquering, this one people defeating another people, one tribe defeating another tribe, it also has a major role to play in identity formations and a different kind of migration. For instance, Rome, the Roman Empire, tried to integrate a lot of the conquered nations. So these conquered nations were also called parts of the Roman empires. They may not have been directly called Romans, but they were Romans, a kind of second class Romans. So a new identity was enforced on them at the cost of their old identity. So think about this, that when the more powerful identity comes in and replaces the so-called lesser identity, and this is something that again you have seen again and again and again. This is something the British tried in India, failed because the Indian identity, the local identity, there was no concrete Indian identity to speak of. The local identities were quite strong. But in Ireland they tried, in Scotland they tried, in most of in the mainland United States of America, North America, and South America, they became quite successful with violence, with genocide. So, and the people who remained, they were migrants in their own home, so to say. They lost their primary identity. Their identities became lesser identities, which, if you ask me, is quite tragic. So these lesser identities, and of course the idea of homeland then becomes a major question, that this homeland would become the homeland of the newly established identity. And the older identities would become a part of this homeland, perhaps marginal parts of the homeland, like Red Indians, who would be pushed to reservations. So that is something that continues, and of course some people would try to adapt the new identity, to adopt the new identity, and sometimes they would become secondary citizens, marginalized citizens, and sometimes some of them would find some kind of success. So a new kind of dynamic was created because the home of one people was destroyed, and that home became the home of another migrant people. And some of the older people were turned into slaves. So slavery is a major part of early colonial, even mid-colonial movements. So you need to remember that. So migration is not merely a few migrants trying to settle. Migration is a far bigger concern that we need to remember. There are many kinds of migration, and we need to remember all these kinds of migrations. Now, it's in the modern times, when violence, war, and these ideas become a little different, that we have the modern idea, the idea of migration as we understand it, the idea of migrants. No longer the idea of armies or military forces invading another thing. Not that kind of a migration. Very often such invasions happen because of the need for space, need for practical necessities, and particularly space. So that happened quite often. And here what we have is a new idea, a new paradigm of migration. And the movement, and this is the other thing, the movement is no longer one way. There are multiple directions in which the movements are happening. So this becomes very complex. The Eastern migrants, I mean, in a globe, it's a wonder why we still have the East and West kind of an idea. The completely Eurocentric globe, which still tells us that anything west of England is west, anything east of England is east. Although if you keep on moving, it is all a matter of perspective. But anyway, such is the world that we live in. And see, what happens is this movement towards the West becomes a significant factor around the 19th and mostly in the 20th century. And this westward movement is not only the East moving to the West, but the West moving to farther West. Because as you know, a lot of Europe shifted to the United States of America, not only the early settlers. I am not talking about the pioneers, they were also migrants, definitely. Some of them were pushed eastwards to Australia, southeast to Australia. But I am talking about the late migrants, late 19th century, early 20th century, when literally millions of people went to the United States of America. Some people went to Canada. And that kind of, and also from farther east, from the Asiatic, the Middle East and the Asiatic East, the Far East even, there is a steady migration towards England, towards Europe. So that is one. There is another direction, but that direction is a more commercial, more neo-colonial kind of movement, which I don't think I'll be speaking about. So let's see. It might come up at one point of time or the other, I don't know. No promises. So now this movement, there are so many issues that we are facing when we are talking about such movements. But let us focus on one, the issue of home. Because that is around that issue of home, everything is centered. The individual migrant and the question of settling, and along with settlement, the question of making a home. Settling does not mean that you have successfully created a home. Settling might mean that you have settled for a settlement. It remains a settlement. You know, in my travels, I have gone to many places. Like I call, if you go to Kedarnath, perhaps, we call it a settlement because only 6 months of the year people stay there, then they come back. So nobody can call that space home. They go there for business purposes, for religious purposes. So they settle. That is a very basic distinction between settlement and creating a home. Home is where you have security, identity, where you have comfort, not necessarily physical comfort, but a kind of a psychological comfort. So home is a very complicated idea. Home is a brilliantly, delightfully complicated idea. So something that you should think of living in the 20th century when we are trying to call ourselves global citizens. Which you try to get a visa and you will see how flimsy that claim is. But the thing is, this idea of home also is a generational thing. I mean, the people who are settling, they might not feel at home, but their children might, their grandchildren might feel more at home. And so on and so forth. There would come a time in 2 generations or 3 generations when this second or third generation will no longer feel any connection to the root homeland. The idea of the homeland, that would become a kind of an alien construct to them. So that root homeland idea, and see, this is the idea of diaspora that I am getting into, the diasporic idea of home. But this diaspora does not survive. After a while, one generation will defy the diaspora, and that generation will demand one single home. The diasporic existence may not be a very happy existence for everyone. It's not always something that you can fall back upon. And I will be speaking about that kind of a slave narrative migration I will be speaking about in a while. So, one of the issues that settlement, the idea of settlement has when you are creating a new home, then you need to know who you are. That is absolutely vital in creating a home, your identity. And in order to know who you are, in order to survive in a new and hostile land, what you need is this idea of a space that you have left, who you were. Because history is a part of identity. Even personal histories, family histories, you need to know who you were to be who you want to be who you are going to become. So that it's not only a question of fighting hostilities. It is a question of creating a space where you can be. Psychologically, I am not talking about a spiritual, religious, epiphanic kind of a thing. What I am talking about is a completely psychological settlement which will turn into the home space. Right. So that is the second point, from diaspora to this idea of the history. Then if you think about refugees, so the land that you have left, that the land that you have been forced to leave, these refugees, if you think about that, then it becomes another kind of migration. It becomes a migration in which a major chunk of yourself is lost. Because in all probability, you know that you cannot go back. I mean, if you think about refugees from Tibet who are there in Himachal Pradesh, if you go to Dharamshala, you will see a lot of Tibetan refugees. There are other Tibetan settlements all around the northern fringes of our country. So that is a major part of the migrants' experience, the refugee experience, people who seek refuge. They seek refuge because they just cannot go back. They may not be allowed to go back. They may be persecuted if they go back. So that remains there. And see, along with this, the other idea that I need to talk about is the slave migration. That is another forced migration, and I will come back to this. That is a migration that has created a whole body of people who are still suffering from crisis of identity. And that migration is something that you can never really forget. What one human being, how one single human being can be uprooted from its home space, from his or her home space, and put into another, forced to create a new future, given a forced identity, an unsavory kind of an identity, not a good, proper identity. So that, and in this context, you would appreciate the distinction between the idea of the home and the homeland. You can be home elsewhere, but your homeland might remain what it always was. So that distinction I need you to remember, and I need you to remember this because quite often the migrant is completely enamored or completely entangled, one might say, in an idea, in a rather romantic idea of the homeland. The homeland may not be as rosy and as grand or great as they might choose to remember. So this romanticization of the homeland, which might be very far away from the political reality of the political idea of the homeland, that is something that we need to interrogate, that we need to remember, because after all, human imagination can do a lot of stuff that we seem rather far-fetched, rather full of fantasy. And of course, the home, and here we have a third and fourth idea. We have third and fourth ideas. I talked about the migrant, the willing migrant, the refugee, then the slaves. They are the ones. So home on the one hand, homeland on the other. The third idea is the refuge idea, the refugee idea, and the fourth idea is the shelter idea, the refugee shelter idea. Where do you put the slaves in this context? They have a completely different dynamic. So home, homeland, refugee, shelter, these four terms, they create one paradigm. But the slavery idea creates a completely new paradigm. But somewhere along the line, the refugee and the slave have one point common in their experience, that is the idea of the future, the uncertainty of the future and the uncertainty of identity. Because migrating to a new land, they are not willing migrants, right? So they have been given something that they were not quite willing to take. So this shelter idea can be a burden to a migrant, to a refugee. This burden is something that can be that can become a huge problem when you combine it with a sense of loss. There might be a sense of loss, there might be a sense of guilt, there might be both. So all these ideas come together and create an experience which is very difficult to understand for a person who has never been dislocated. The dislocation that migration involves, that dislocation can be pleasant, it can be rather unpleasant, it can be tragic. So that is basically my introduction. Let me start with the discussion, because construction of identity is something that the migrant constantly does. When we are talking about willing migrants, then there is a weird dynamic that is created between home and homeland. If the migrant is well settled and has created a proper home of sorts, but The migrant thinks of it as home. Then when the migrant comes back to the homeland, it becomes a very curious kind of an exchange, because the people who are there in the homeland, to them the migrant is a problem. To them the migrant, well, the NRI as we call them in India, non-resident Indians, sometimes in the recent times the abbreviation has often meant now returned to India. But anyway, non-reliable Indians, there are many jokes like that, but their relationship with the homeland, because they have chosen to leave their homeland for whatever reason. And again, as always, there is no judgment in this. This is a purely literary discussion. A lot of my friends are now NRIs. So these non-resident Indians, what about their feeling for their homeland? People who are here, who could not be NRIs, they often challenge the NRI's love for India, calling it false love, because these NRIs did not find it in their hearts to stay and serve the whatever notion of nation they might have. So that is a dynamic, that is a kind of issue that is still somewhat there, I'd say. Not entirely, but still somewhat there. I remember this movie, this film called Pardes. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may not have. I will strongly suggest that you do not see it. Anyway, my apologies to the makers of the film. It's dated. That's a problem. And this film, it's a Shah Rukh Khan starrer, so some of you may have seen it. It was by Subhash Ghai, so the grandness, opulence, shooting in the US, the sprawling fields of Punjab, etc., Punjabi farmers and all that kind of stuff, those were there. Anyway, but the reason I remember this particular film is because there was a song in it in which Amrish Puri, the NRI figure in the film, is singing, "I love my India." The other reason that I kind of remember this film, I kind of remember there was this very small exchange, a very heated exchange towards the end of the film, where there was a romantic problem between two very anglicized heroes, and the heroine it's a love triangle sort of a thing, and quite expectedly the heroine is falling at the end for the hero, who is Shah Rukh Khan. And what we have here is both of them NRIs, but Shah Rukh Khan is the more Sanskari kind of an NRI. Apurva Agnihotri is more westernized at that point of time. Now if you see the film, it would seem silly. Whatever the other boy, the more Americanized boy is doing, it would seem quite silly. But still, at that point of time, there was this usual fare of a tripartite thing, some violence. They were trying to copy the Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge sort of a thing, etc. Let's not call it a copy or trying to copy, because anyway. So the thing is, there was this dialogue that you people come from America and you pretend to love your country, whereas you have no understanding of your country anymore. So that I couldn't find the dialogue, and I didn't have it in me to see the film once again. Sorry. And the thing is, these NRIs at that point of time were wooed for their money. There were a lot of benefits given. They were asked to invest. The open market was quite working at that point of time. And they were out for their money, but there was some resentment. The homeland resenting the migrants. So the dialogue that I kind of remember is where they are challenging that you have come back, you have no idea what this country is anymore, you have left us. There is a criticism of these people. There is a resentment that we see amongst the homelanders towards these people who have left the homeland, people who are perhaps they have found success in another land and that sort of a thing. And so the Indian Sanskari kind of a thing is made to win over the westernized kind of feeling, the westernized kind of approach that is shown. So Indians are still superior. Even in that song, there is this idea that India is the Mathe ki Vindhya kind of a thing. You can have that translation. And there is also this figure. Incidentally, the heroine is called Ganga. So you have your brilliant 90s symbolism there. So the film came out in 1997, if I remember correctly, probably. So, and the thing is, these people, also the other point of interest is that these people, they always have this uber romanticized view of their country. That their country is this, always singing, green fields, people always happy, they are always doing puja part, etc. That sort of a feeling is presented, that this idealized notion of the homeland. This is something that the migrants often hold on to. And even, in my travels, and I don't know whether this is an attempt at hiding their guilt of leaving their homeland or something like that, leaving their people, leaving their relatives, their parents perhaps, so on and so forth. So perhaps it is an expression of that guilt, perhaps it isn't. But there is this idea and there is this concern about the homeland. And this is something that I have personally experienced, that whenever I have been abroad interacting with local Indians, and when I say local Indians, I mean they are now locals there, but they still flaunt their Indianness, which is rather a problem. But give me a second, I'll come back to this in a second. And the thing is, the migrant is looking back with this idealized idea, looking back with a concern which might be genuine or which might be just out of duty, because being Indians they need to worry about India, or it might be because they genuinely feel concerned. So all these three are possible. And this concern often becomes rather irritating, that why is this happening, why is this politician doing something, and you tend to tell the migrant that you be there, you be the NRI and let us worry about our problems. These are no longer your problems. When they do things, they exaggerate and they try to seem too concerned. So that kind of a resentment is there, that kind of a resentment you feel, that you did leave India, so leave India, be the migrant, nobody forced you to. In case of, I'm not talking about refugees, I'm definitely not talking about slaves, that's a different dynamic, but people who have willingly left, they still carry their homeland with them, at least for a while, at least for a couple of generations. It's completely normal. And the resentment that we see in this film, they are not judging the migrants for leaving. They are judging the migrants for particularly in Pardes, and this is why I even mentioned Pardes, they are judging the migrants for adapting the alien culture. If they were migrants and if they were Sanskari Indians, it would have been all fine. There would be a bigger problem in the film because who would Ganga choose then? Right. But the thing is, there is no judgment for leaving, but judgment for leaving the culture. So this culturation is a point. How long can you resist the culture of your new chosen land? How long? And should you do that? Because you have chosen this new land over your older land. So should you not try to integrate? Or, what people do is that they become confused. Which is their home? For a while, there is this confusion. That is the new land their home? They are trying desperately to create a home, but in their own construct of their selves, their identities, they have this question, which one is my home? It's a complicated process. Again, no judgment whatsoever. And the problems that arise from it, this tension from their present locations, and still this idea that we hold on to, this is a word that you are familiar with, roots. So whether they should go back to their roots or whether they should be a proper member of the new adopted culture. So that remains a question for them for a long time. And as I said, in a couple of generations, in 3 generations or something like that, the children, they are completely exposed to the new culture, to the new land, and to them their old land is unique. It's a novelty. So they do not try to be what their parents were in some long distant past. So that is another kind of movement, but it's not migration. Now, these adopted countries and the new old countries, this tension would remain, the romance would remain when you are looking at new migration. But there is also a tendency of creating ghettos. Because if you think about a city like New York, there is a little China, there is a little India, and so on and so forth, little Japan, little Italy perhaps, if you are into all those mafia kind of films. So, but this ghettoization is very much there, and they try to hang on to the older culture, and it has always been like that. It's just because the Dutch has been there for longer, they have been integrated more. The French have been there longer, so they do not seem like their ethnic identities anymore perhaps. But the new migrants, they still carry some kind of memory, and memory is a vital part of all this. And this sense of belonging, it takes a while to create that sense of belonging, so the migrant sticks to these ghetto-like spaces, right? The migrant does not really want to create a new space, a new identity in a new culture. As I again repeating myself, in 2 or 3 generations, the child will no longer find it to be the new culture. So that kind of a dynamic is there, and this ghetto space, this little India, little China kind of a place, that gives them this sense of belonging at the beginning. It gives them this sense of being protected. It's not merely a question of shelter, but it's also a question of protection that is being given. And one text that you are familiar with, and you are probably thinking of this text at this very moment, is Jhumpa Lahiri's Namesake. And you see in one generation how Gogol becomes more American, right? And how the Indianness is no longer acceptable to him. His life, his relations, his everything about him is resisting the older homeland construct, because he has already constructed a homeland for himself in the new land. And the child does not share the parents' nostalgia at all. So when the child is brought back home, it is again a place of weirdness, I guess. This is the other place for the child. So this experience, and the Namesake is quite brilliant in this, and even the film, I would strongly suggest that you take a look at the film. One, two, three. So the idea of the homeland to these people, to this particular generation of new citizens of the new land, it becomes a very complicated issue. They do not find it in themselves to align themselves with the older land. They belong to the new land now. And as I said, the Namesake, but there is another kind of an idea. To them, this land is my land, and to a lot of others, the people belonging to the older land, they are no longer a part of their lives. This becomes vital, but of course, let me not harp on this one. Let me move on to the other kind of homeland idea, where homeland becomes a myth. Not merely a memory, not merely a nostalgia, but homeland becomes a myth. And this is where I come to the African American experience, the slave experience. When this kind of construction of homeland, which is not memory based but rather myth based, it becomes a very new kind of an experience. Usually in continental slave trades, the slaves were not taken far away from their homelands. The cultures they were taken to were familiar cultures. Slavery has always been there. I mean, we hide it rather well. We give it different names, serfdom, and etc. But slavery has always been there. And let's not have any illusion about that. Even now there are different kinds of slavery which we tend to try to hide somehow or the other. And this African American thing, where these people are forced to migrate, uprooted completely, and in a couple of generations they lose their sense of history, because their tradition of recording history was different. So that history, when that person is uprooted, when the family is uprooted, pushed into a completely alien environment and made to work hard and killed and destroyed and without any possibility of a future, the idea of the homeland slowly becomes a myth. And what I find very problematic is that they were called African, they were called Negroes, they were called black people, they were called colored people. Now we are kind of settling with African American. And I strongly object, because why African American? Most of these people have been in America as long as the white people. So they should be called Americans, no hyphenated identity required. But we still live in a colonial kind of a situation, however much we may deny it. We live in denial more than anything else. But this idea, generations of men who have no contact whatsoever with their homeland, with Africa, and these people, they are taken into a new identity. They are settled into a new identity, and this forced migration that I am talking about, they are, when I say uprooted, they are totally uprooted. And the African American idea is a huge problem, because Africa is not a monolithic space. Africa is a large body with varied cultures. The old colonial idea regarding Africa, we should not share that idea. Not at all. Africa is a variety of lands, a variety of cultures, a variety of civilizations. And people who come from these varied lands, they cannot have one single African identity. So when they look back to a past, this past has been mythified, because these people do not remember anymore from which part of Africa their ancestors may have come. They may remember, they may not remember. In all probability, nobody remembers. Why should they? It has been such a long time. They have been here, about 4 generations back. Who remembers? Is there any specific need for identity formation? Because in the next few generations, everything has happened. 200 years of history is enough to solidify an identity. It was enough for the white people in America. So why shouldn't it be enough for the slaves? Right. So this is the forced migration. They are not refugees, they are migrations. I will be talking about the refugees a little, not much, because that is not where my expertise lies. There are plenty of people who can talk about refugees. And the complicated issue here is memory, because they have some familial memory. They inherit certain memories, but these memories are not completely reliable. There is some romanticization done, there is some perhaps even glamorization done, and these memories become myths. And this mythified past is something that these people are forced to live with, because the new land is still giving them a segregated identity. We all know about segregation. We all know how long it took to fight segregation. Late 20th century, even now racism is just as strong as ever, perhaps stronger in recent times. When I say racism, I do not exclude any country. We are equally racist. It only depends on the idea of superiority. The moment you become superior, you become a kind of a racist. It takes a really enlightened mind not to be racist. But anyway, that's a complete digression. Sorry about that. This African part of the signifier, that these people are African Americans, this is so incredibly objectionable. But we do that. How many of us think of, when the word American is used, the usual signified is a white face, is a white man. We tend to think like that when I say somebody from England. If you have not, please read To Serve With Love by E.R. Braithwaite. You will see how racism was rampant, and it still is rampant. So Anyway, but the problem that these people actually had is that, say, the Indians who are shifting to America, the Chinese people who are shifting to America, the Dutch, the French, they have their own cultural and folk traditions with them. They go there and they find other people of that particular cultural alignment, cultural signification over there. But these African people did not have that luxury. They carried some of their folk elements, but after a while, they were all destroyed. Their names were changed. They were all known by the surname of the master, the person who bought human beings. So that is how kind of a deculturation was happening. And after a while, they did not have the time or the energy or the possibility of holding on to their own cultures. So they were in a void, so to say, in a cultural void, and they could not adopt the new culture because they're simply not allowed to. So a new kind of an idea had to be brought in, and the African American became something powerful. This is a migration which had actually happened centuries back. But still people are suffering from this kind of migration. And it's incredible that even in the 21st century, right, we still have people who are not allowed to mingle with the so-called mainstream culture of the West. They have to create their own racial, cultural identity, even being a major part of the construction of the nation that they live in. But such is life, I guess. Now, this colonial era of inferiority, the perception of superiority and inferiority with skin color, that still remains. And migration has a lot to do with such mentality, with such pigmentation. So these African Americans were forced to create their own ethos. They were forced to create a new identity, a completely separate identity for themselves. And we know about the Harlem Renaissance. We know about all these artists, playwrights, poets, writers, everybody. They are all coming in and they are contributing to this idea of a new selfhood. A selfhood which will stand strong, which would not only resist this kind of segregation, but will also emphasize on the separateness which they are now forced to emphasize upon. Because that is how the migrant must survive. If not allowed to integrate, then they must create a new identity. And that is what these people have been doing for a long time. Even in our cultures, we consider ourselves to be permissive. We used to consider ourselves. And but still, Anglo-Indians and other such communities always had a very difficult time surviving the Jewish community here because they were religiously persecuted, the minorities and such. And then this idea of Africa, still in popular imagination, Africa remains the dark continent. And such a colonial perspective has actually harmed humanity. It has harmed our openness and the right to call ourselves human. But anyway, let me not get too judgmental over this. And I will just give you something that Malcolm X had written about Africa. Just take a look at this quotation. This would be important. So the idea of creating your homeland in your homeland, because the land they are living in, they consider their homeland, but they are resisted in their homeland, segregated in their homeland. This is an experience unique in the world. There are parallel experiences, but nothing like this one. So what Malcolm X is saying is quite significant, and you need to think about such a thing, because migration doesn't really end with the migration. Migration actually continues for a very long time. It becomes a historical process which has its own history, which has its own narrative. And speaking of narratives, one text which is very interesting is, of course, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. This is a book which is quite unique. This is a book, it's one of the rare texts in which we find a testimony to a successful person of another ethnicity, an ethnicity which has been unaccepted. So this text in which we see the success story, because Douglass became a journalist and a politician, I think, and Douglass was quite successful. In fact, I think he also became a minister. So this is a documentation of people who had to fight, who had to genuinely fight, and Frederick Douglass's book becomes inspirational even now. And which is rather tragic is that the land still resists such people. The land still resists when such a person tries to construct a home. As I said, these are the people on whose labor the nation was created, and these are the people who are still not allowed to have similar some of them are still, it's almost as if they are still settlers. They are still no longer given a home. The other communities resist. They do not want to accept them. I mean, you can take a look at, when we are talking about this particular experience, the following texts would also give you a fair ideas of how exactly and what exactly. Some of the texts, I am not, this is not an exhaustive kind of a list, but some of these texts would give you an idea. The idea, see, in The Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison writes that you cannot really find the history of our people in books and stuff like that. You have to go to the local shops, you have to go to the gin mills, as he says, to find what actually is the basic history of our people, because there is not even basic documentation. Literature of the African American experience does not really have as great a history as it should have had. And again, you cannot help but become a little judgmental at this point. And of course, the book that is quite wonderful, and I personally love this particular book, that speaks of this experience of this entire narrative of generations, is Alex Haley's Roots. What I find absolutely fascinating is that in the title, Roots, the saga of an American family. It was printed in 1976, I think. What Haley does is that he does not say the saga of an African American family or the saga of a black family or the saga of a colored family, but the saga of an American family. So this demand of acceptance, so this demand that integration has to be there because we are as American as anybody else, that demand becomes vital. And it is a fantastically, it's a challenge to this idea of being always the darker brother kind of a thing. That kind of brotherhood that we read about. So that is the other phase, that is the expression of the angst of how a whole experience of a people can remain within this sphere of antagonism. From the beginning to the modern point, nothing changes. Right. The other communities, they have similar experiences, but they have, there are slightly different experiences. Let me talk about another book. This is Ishiguro's debut novel, in fact, A Pale View of the Hills. It came out in 1982. And we see a migrant unit. We see the mother is coming to this foreign land from Nagasaki, and her experiences in Nagasaki are right after the atom bomb, right after we see a bomb ravaged Nagasaki. It's a wonderful presentation. It's something that will give you goosebumps. So this woman who has willingly left Nagasaki, who has willingly left Japan, Etsuko, and she has a daughter called Keiko, but the daughter cannot accept the new identity. And with the earlier trauma that she had in Nagasaki, I mean everyone, practically everybody related to Hiroshima and Nagasaki must have lived traumatic lives. Some of them might still be living. So this tragic, and what Etsuko does is that she creates a cocoon of denial. She had to leave. She took the opportunity and she had to leave, but Keiko cannot, and she ends up, she has a tragic end. And this is something that we see, that these migrants, for many migrants, migration is completely traumatic, even when the migration is willing. This trauma is something, and because for Keiko the migration was far too disturbing, far too unsettling. She could not create a home space in the new land, in the adopted homeland. She could not. And it's not only, it's a question of resolving the baggage of mixed cultures that we see. It's a question of the possibility of return, or rather the impossibility of return. So you cannot associate yourself with the new land, you cannot go back. And this option of this impossibility of not going back is something that creates this trauma for many a mind. It's not always willing, it's not always rejection. That is also a part of it. But see, Etsuko becomes a refugee. She can be called a refugee perhaps, but it's by choice. Keiko did not choose. Keiko was forced, and leaving the homeland was absolutely disastrous for her. So the migrant experience, forced migration, rejection, exclusion, all these ideas, but even when we have a willing set of migrants, the migrants may not end up with a happy ending. So I would suggest, let me not harp on this for a longer time, because this is getting a little longer than I actually intended. But see, the 20th century is essentially an era of migration. And as I keep telling you, although I am not an expert on this, we cannot really speak about migration without talking about partition. The partition related migration, I was talking about trauma. You can't really speak about greater trauma than the partition trauma that our part of the world suffered. Even in Europe, there has been several partitions. There has been several realignments, redrawings of the map. So there has been a lot of trauma over there also, Yugoslavia, and you can just kind of look at European history and you will see Eastern Europe have suffered much in this context. And the end of the colonial era was the beginning of this traumatic experience for the colonized, because the colonizers did not exactly give the colonized a fair kind of a deal. I mean, I'm sure it will have many contestations, but anyway. And if you think about it, if you think about partition literature, as I said that I'm not really looking at the sociology or the history of the thing, but I'm looking at migration from a literary perspective. And partition literature is necessary because otherwise statistics will never be able to carry the actual human trauma. You know, novels, stories, poems, films, even a film as late as Kissa would tell you about how partition traumas keep following people. And this religious political conflict that has plagued many a nation in our part of the world, in other parts of the world, this is not a direct result of the partition. Perhaps there are deep-rooted distinctions in it as well, other issues as well, but these ensuing ideas have been creating political rifts. So all those migrations, if you think about it, I mean, I know you'd be thinking about Manto, you would be thinking about Khushwant Singh, you would be thinking about a lot of other, Hisham Sahani perhaps, and a lot of other authors who are talking about the partition. A great amount of partition literature is there, and novels such as Train to Pakistan would come immediately to mind. I mean, that is probably the most talked novel when we are talking about partition literature. But this predicament that we are talking about, it's not merely a question of resettlement, but a question of crafting a home. So people from the other side, people who had to leave their homes, they have often found derision, they have often found violence, they have not been accepted because they were refugees in colonies in a settler kind of a sense. The refugees come and they create the colonies that are created for them, the shelters, the housings that are created for them often have associations of stigma. And if you are, I mean, the idea of the homeland in Bengal, there is still this idea of Desh, that our actual country was India, because pre-partition Bangladesh was India. This is something that people tend to forget, that pre-migration, of course in the 1970s there were a lot of migrations as well, because as we know history has not been kind to this particular region. And this idea of the trauma that survived for a long time, I mean if you think about Hrithik Ghatak's films, then you would know that how this particular history continued to traumatize the people of this space, and also the Punjab border, also the western border. So similar factors are there, and even now we have a series of books which are still talking about the partition, which are still looking at that defining event in the history of the subcontinent. I mean, you can think of these books. So these books keep on looking back at that event. Even now in the 21st century, we keep looking back at that event. We keep looking back at migrations, and identity is still defined by the migrants. If you think about the Ghoti Bangal kind of distinction that still rules, you look at the matrimonial columns and you'll see how significant this particular distinction is in our part of the world. So that and the inherited memory that still gives us our identity, that becomes very important. And there is this idea of legitimacy, this idea in recent times, the idea of immigration, not only migration but immigration, that I don't have to tell you how significant this is, because all over the world the idea of immigration is quite a thorny kind of an idea, quite a prickly kind of an idea. And the asylum seekers, the refugees, the illegal immigrants, there are so many ideas. If you think about Gun Island, Amitabh Ghosh is looking at this particular idea. I'm not going to really talk a lot about Gun Island, but he has approached this idea. So the variety of terms, migrants, immigrants, trafficked expatriates, and foreign labor, refugees, etc. So this tells us just how much migration is happening each and every moment, each and every day. Right now at this moment people are migrating or trying to migrate from one place to the other. We still remember the picture of the dead child and the whole politics that ensued over that photograph, over that tragic photograph. And asylum, refugees, these kind of migrations, the violence that they carry in them, perhaps with them, and the shelter giving countries, they fear that violence. And such dynamics, it's a completely chaotic to a certain extent kind of a situation, a dynamic which is still ruling our global politics. So migration can never be played or undervalued, because it's a constant truth that it's happening. Because homelessness and the necessity for a new home, this is a movement many individuals, many communities suffer through even now, even in our ultra-modern digital kind of a civilization. You might have a home, very soon you might find out that you do not have your identity. Your identity is taken away from you on very flimsy excuses. And these remappings, the civil wars, the partitions, the political partitions, the religious partitions, we have a host of novels. Once again, I will just give you a few. You take a look. This is just an exemplary kind of a list, not an exhaustive list. If you take a look at these books, you will get an idea just how much migration and how much this kind of movement is still ruling our literature and our experience and our history. apart from these large geopolitical kind of uh, movements, there are also individual migrations. I should mention this because this is one of my favorite texts, and this is a migration. This is the microcosm, the micro experience. Because if you read Jhumpa Lahiri's The Lowland, you will see how an individual can become homeless, how an individual can struggle to create an identity because the confirmed identity that she had was taken away from her by her own homelanders, by her own state, and she had to relocate, and not only to relocate geographically but to relocate herself. And this is a migration that quite happens because quite often, and she does not really represent a huge community or a huge political kind of a group or something who become labeled as certain illegitimate outfits or something like that, and they are thrown out of the state system, they are persecuted by the state system. It's not like that, but it's a personal quest. So migration can also become a personal quest. Not only like in the Ibis trilogy, that's a number of people excluded, but that's the idea of exclusion. I did write a paper once upon a time about the narrative of exclusion. So that is there, and for instance, if you think about a text like White Sargasso Sea, you see how the protagonist has to relocate herself from her own home. She has to relocate herself and lose herself over there. It's much more traumatic. I mean, there is no comparative scale. This is also another kind of trauma that the protagonist faces, just like Keiko in A Pale View of the Hills. It's another kind of trauma which makes one so distant from oneself that one cannot survive anymore, that one has to become insane. This insanity is, of course, a kind of a perspective. So in these cases, the idea of migration and the idea of hybridity, something which I did not quite deliberately introduce in this discussion, because hybridity is a completely different discussion altogether. This White Sargasso Sea introduces this idea of dislocation and hybridity. So that generations, those things are vital. Those experiences are vital in the migration experiences. Not only the macro migrations, but also the micro migrations. Not only the economic willing migrations, but the unwilling willing migrations. Because these people they do not really want to leave their home, but they have no choice. They are not immediately persecuted, but they cannot be at home in their homes anymore. They have lost their home space, the sense of the home space. So they must create another home space elsewhere. So this becomes a vital experience, right? And I did start with birthdays. So it's only fitting that I end with another film, and the film that I am thinking of is Haider. The Kashmir idea, the Kashmir identity is something that has become even more complicated these days, right? So the Kashmir identity is to be judged, to be experienced from the homeland identity. We know about the complications, we know how a certain part of the population was forced to migrate. But then such political events happen, such global political events happen, that people who were living there did not feel at home anymore, because the security and safety that we expect from the home space was completely denied to them. Life became very complicated. I'm not going to get into that. We all know the dynamics of the Kashmiri experience. So I just wanted to remind you how, when this home space paradigm is just lost because of a new narrative of persecution, everything changes. A person becomes a migrant, a settler in his or her own home space. So these myths of prosperity, there are mythifications, there are glamorized look at history, but the persecuted often become the persecuting. Such things also happen. But the thing is, if you look at the present, if you look at the present human experience, you will see the trauma that the loss of home space entails, the trauma that is created, the trauma that forces people to become migrants. Now, I will just I have one other thing to mention. This is another paper that I had once presented. It's a published paper. It's on Life of Pi. My reading of Life of Pi was that it's a manual of migration. Because in Life of Pi, what we saw was this man, this boy, traveling from space A to space B. In the process, the boy loses the tiger in him. Right? So the kind of symbolism that we had in the text and in the film, it clearly showed that later on that they were all a part of the boy. He was just experiencing, he was just creating a myth of his own. So he becomes this completely acceptable migrant because the tiger was no longer in him. He had lost the tiger. And after losing the tiger, the hybridization, because the tiger was the older culture and the tiger is gone, so he is completely open to the new culture. He can now completely integrate with the new culture, because the tiger will never come back. Richard Parker will never come back. So that remains, because this is how the Western cultures, this is how the recipient cultures look at migration, migrants, that you need to uproot yourself, you need to completely reorient yourself and become one with the new culture, so you will be acceptable. You must not hold on to your past or your culture or your practices or something like that, because that might disrupt the new culture. Whether that is justified or not, just because they are giving shelter, whether they have any right to say or not, is again open to contestation. But this is how things stand. This is what Life of Pi kind of Pi Patel becoming a completely saintly kind of a figure who has a brilliant story to tell, which is a story of amazement story, but even at the end it's a story of peace, of cohabitation. So that is the expectation from migrants. The trauma that the migrants carry, the new homes are no longer willing to accept, are not willing to accept. So what happens is, the reason I chose to look at the literary perspective is that the theoretical perspective does not always carry the human experience, does the theory, we can theorize trauma, but the impact of that trauma remains a part of the lived experience, and the lived experience can, as I believe, be only conveyed through the arts. So this literature, and see, the human experience, and this is my final point, the human experience of migration, of home, crisis, home, settlement, safety, comfort, all these ideas come together into building a home. I have already spoken about this. And the thing is, the moment you talk about migration from nation A to nation B, the moment you introduce the idea of nationality, an idea of artificiality comes in. Because migration involves something greater, a greater human experience, which is not bound by shifting artificial boundaries which define nations. So the individual psyche cannot always align with the idea of the nation, but it can always align with the idea of home. And if the nation can become home, it is the best. But if the nation cannot become home, it becomes a huge problem, and migration of one sort or the other becomes necessary. I'm sure you will have a lot of comments on this, a lot of contestation, a lot of challenges. I sincerely hope so. But let me end here. I hope this helped. Thank you so much.